thank you all for coming out. So I'm going to talk, as Jen mentioned, about a book that I've recently published on Zebulon Pike. Came out month before last in January. And I have some slides for you. Most of them are images that I took, and I did the best I could to try and get to the spot where Pike was on the same day of the year. There's one where I cheated, and I have I have him in the wintertime in a shot I took in June. So there's one that didn't work out, but most of them are on or near the exact day he was there. The other caveat I want to offer before we get started is that some of the slides are a little bit texty. That is, they've got a lot of words on them. And that's by design. I don't necessarily envision that you'll read every single word, but I wanted to give readers in the book and also you all here tonight a sense of the kind of language that he used and a feel for the language of the time that I'm encountering in my sources. And so don't worry about reading every last word. I'm not going to stand up here and read them to you, but if they'll kind of convey an impression of the language of the time, and I'll paraphrase kind of the most important points that you need to understand. So if you can't read all of it, don't worry about that. So let me jump in. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I'll be glad to take questions and answers as long or as short as you're interested in it. And there's after the introduction, there's two parts to the talk. One will be about Pike's early life and young adulthood. The other will be about his adventures in the Rocky Mountains, probably the most famous part of his expedition. So let's begin on January 20th, 1807. Pike was the commander of a U.S. military expedition to explore the Louisiana Purchase. And the expedition had become badly lost, and they had wandered about in the Rocky Mountains for several weeks. And on this day, Pike found himself near here in the wet mountain valley of Colorado, near the southwest of Pueblo. And the expedition was in a desperate situation. The men were too weak to go on, but they were too imperiled not to. They were cold and hungry and inadequately clothed, and they didn't know where they were. On this particular day, Pike discovered that two of his men, John Sparks and Thomas Darty, had frostbite so bad that they could not walk any longer. And so, furnishing them with as much ammunition and food as he could spare, he exhorted them to resist their fate with fortitude. And with that, he left them, abandoned, crippled men alone in the wilderness. And I want you to recall this word, fortitude, right there, because this is going to be a word that has powerful meaning for Pike and that we'll come back to repeatedly throughout the event this evening. So 2 weeks later, from the safety of a small fort that he built on the yonder side of the forbidding mountains, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, in the San Luis Valley, he sent a rescue party back to retrieve Sparks and Darty. And the rescuers found Sparks and Darty alive, but still unable to travel. And so they returned to Pike on February 17th. And in a dark and desperate gesture, they had removed some of the bones that the cold had separated from their toes and sent them back with the rescuers, begging Pike by all that was sacred not to leave them alone in the wilderness. "Ah, little did they know my heart," Pike wrote in his journal, "if they could suspect me of conduct so ungenerous." And he vowed to do whatever was necessary to deliver them to their, quote, grateful country. And that concept of gratitude as something that a nation owes people who sacrifice for it physically is another concept that we will come back to. So what are we to make of all this? So What are we to make of all of this? Who was Pike? Is a question I want to ask today. Was he an intrepid explorer whose hardiness in the face of difficulty opened the West to his nation? Or was he a reckless commander whose poor decision-making exposed his men to unnecessary danger? Or perhaps, as some have speculated, was he a spy whose secret orders to reconnoiter Santa Fe impelled him onward even in the face of extreme danger? Pike left us few records of his early life, and as a result, most historians who have tried to figure him out have looked solely at his official military journals and reports, which are 2 big, thick volumes. They're very unwieldy, even contradictory documents, and as a result, we're left with those contradictory images of him that I mentioned a moment ago. But what my book tries to do is to employ some new strategies for understanding Pike. One of the things that I did was I hired a genealogist who compiled a whole bunch of documents about his early life that no Pike historian had ever looked at before. Another thing that I did was to look at some letters. He's only left us, other than his official military reports, he's only left us 14 letters in his own hand. But I wrung as much meaning out of those 14 letters as I could, reading between the lines and tried to read them in the context of the time. And whereas previous historians have kind of dropped in quotes in their work on Pike in the past, I really took them seriously from an analytical perspective. So I tried to figure out, what did they tell us about his character? They're all from the time period of his young adult life. So they kind of give us a glimpse of him at a formative moment. Another thing that I've done is that I've read everything that Pike read. We have about a dozen different books that we know he read, that he said he read or was influenced by, and I've gone back and I've read all of those things in order to try and get a sense of what kind of information about his culture and world did he have available to him. And then finally, as you'll see, I pay close attention to the natural environment, especially the men's bodies, Sparks and Doherty's toes, and other aspects of their physical experience of exploration and of the landscape. And after doing all of this, I'm convinced that above all, Pike was a nationalist. That's the single best word to characterize his personality and his ideas, is nationalism. Now, this wasn't a given at the time, because America at this time was a young and fragile nation. We didn't know it was going to succeed as a great democratic experiment as we know today. Many at the time believed that it would not, and perhaps even should not, survive. Not everybody decided to cast their lot with the nation. But early in life, Pike became persuaded that the best way to advance his considerable ambitions was to sacrifice physically for his nation. And his actions in the Rocky Mountains need to be read in this light, I think. So let's turn to Pike's early life. He was born in 1779. This is the middle of the American Revolution. His father is a soldier, and Pike grows up at frontier army posts like this one, Fort Massac, which is down on the Ohio River, a little bit east of its confluence with the Mississippi. And as products of the American Revolution, military forts like this one are markers of a historic shift in Western civilization history. For the first time in Western civilization, in the middle and late part of the 18th century, it's no longer unanimously accepted that the only way to get ahead in life is to be born to high social station. That you can actually advance, you can raise your social status through virtuous behavior. This is an increasingly widely accepted idea at the end of the 1700s. So Pike, like many young Americans of the day, was interested in this concept of virtue. What did virtue entail? Well, a few stuffy old Englishmen thought that it had to do with manners, and in particular, it had to do with bodies, and how you carried yourself and how you behaved in public was displayed your virtue. So a gentleman should never be caught lolling supinely, or worse yet, sitting with the stiff immobility of a bashful booby.